Thank you, Alicia. So OB, we talked about possibly adjourning the meeting before we start the workshop.
Okay.
Instead of having the workshop in the middle kind of and then adjourning. Just.
And it's okay, is it okay to adjourn the workshop?
Adjourn the meeting.
Adjourn the meeting, but people still could participate in the workshop if they wanted to.
That's the idea.
Okay, so we'll actually go through a regular adjourning the meeting thing, future considerations before we.
Yeah, hopefully it'll go kind of quick because we do have Corey here but they are we do have that dark skies discussion item. So I just wanted to briefly have that, get through that, and then we'll go, quick. And then citizens to be heard should really just be limited to anybody who doesn't want to talk about the landscaping ordinance. Right. That'll all happen during the workshop.
And remind me if I forget.
Okay.
I probably won't.
All right, are we ready? Sure. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to call this meeting of the Planning Commission on February 26th. And it is about 34 past 4 as we start the meeting. First thing I'll note is I think we are all here in terms of commissioners except for Aaron. Are there any citizens to be heard on topics that are not on the agenda? I think I hear none and see none. Any ex parte communications or disclosures, folks?
I already emailed Elisa. I don't know if this is where this goes or not, but I already emailed you and Elisa today. Forthcoming, there will be discussion of a UDOT project on Highway 128. Because I'm a stakeholder for that project in my professional capacity, I'm henceforth recusing myself from all that discussion of UDOT Highway 128.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And no others. Approval of the minute meetings from last time. That was January 22nd, 2024.
I motion to approve the minutes.
Second that.
Okay, it's moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor of passing the minutes as they stand? That's it. Any abstaining? Steve's going to abstain here. Everybody else who's here is voting yes. County Commission update.
I first wanted to know where Corey is. He
can't be in Castle Valley or he's violating our ordinances on animals.
Okay, all right, I'll move on. So quick update on the 220 meeting, the commission meeting. The Escape Adventures conditional use permit that was postponed. The vote was 4-1. I was in opposition to that vote, and Jacques Hadler was recused himself. The Creekside PUD, the waiver of warranty bond, that passed unanimously. Desert Soul Infrastructure Extension passed unanimously. The large lot residential to general business 1540 Spanish Valley Drive was sent back to the Planning Commission. So you guys have that going for you. That was passed 4-1. I was in opposition of sending it back, and Walker abstaining from that vote. The Moab area affordable housing master plan was approved, passed unanimously, and the RAISE grant for Sand Flats letter of support was passed 4-2 with Walker and Hadler in opposition. So that's the quick update. Do you guys want any elaboration on that?
Just one question. Any comments or any reasoning behind sending that one back to the planning?
Well, I think this is just my interpretation, and a comment that I heard from Commissioner Winfield was that there was a lot more public input to the county commission, and that there was more that in support of that rezone than there was to the planning commission, and he felt that the difference of public input should send it back to the planning commission. But, some these are again, just generalizations, is that you guys always get a little less public comment than we would. So
And what's your impression from being in that meeting? Do you think there was notable difference in positive versus negative? Because if I remember right, almost all of the feedback here was negative.
right. And I think there's a variety at this point. And then to me, it was a little odd because the commissioners that proposed the motion to send it back and the second both said they were in opposition of going against the planning commission, and then turned around and did that. So I was just like, oh, okay. So yeah, it's I don't know what to say. Just think we're kicking the can.
It's
Yeah,
definitely.
I was pretty frustrated. And yeah, I was pretty frustrated.
I guess they've always got the prerogative to do that, right, Trish? So, any
guess.
idea when that's gonna come back up?
I can speak to that. So we reached out to the applicant last week to set up a meeting for him to come in because he had actually reached out to us before the meeting, just right before the meeting that day, to ask if we could do anything different to the application at that point. So there may be a desire to change the direction that they're going. So we're gonna meet with the applicant and go from there. It might not come back to you in the same form, but I don't think it'll be by even the next meeting. Probably be like a month from now.
I mean, I think Commissioner Walker, stated some really valid points, and Elisa, you could probably do a better job of stating, but his overall, sentiment was, again, we're like in this process of future land use plan, and we should really wait for that before we're making, again, these are really spot zoning decisions, and yeah. So
Lisa, will it be a brand new application?
Oh, yeah, if they wanted to change direction, yeah, it would be a
Even
new,
if they didn't change direction, you have to
Mhm.
public hearings.
yes, we'd have to go back to public hearings, and so that's where we're at. It does put a little strain on code enforcement in terms of the gray area of how we treat these situations and how we can be fair across the board to other properties that might be in the same violation situation that they're in, and how do we, now that we kind of have this process where we're just kind of pushing it out, but still letting them operate, it feels a little precarious. So we're trying to navigate that as best we can.
do you mind if I ask Mary, can I ask you a question? Was that ever, or anybody, was it ever zoned business? Okay, so that's it. So I've had quite a bit of public clamor, like it used to be zoned
Well,
business, and I'm like, I don't actually know that.
What happened was the which company used it as a part of their family business. Prior to you been there that long.
Right,
Well, and the staff mentioned that in their staff report, that business had gone away.
right,
And once you set up non-conforming use, you can keep using it as long as it stays in the same family. and the same
Sure.
use,
Okay,
it doesn't
thank
change
you.
Businesses,
right.
but this happened to change business.
Okay, I appreciate that. That helps. That's some of the public clamor is surrounding this idea, but I
Black's
appreciate that.
also something you're not supposed to listen to instead of reason.
True.
Unless they bring something different to the table
Right,
to show why and how it could be approved.
Right.
Public matters, not ours.
I agree with, I 100% agree with that. So there you are. It was not a very fun meeting,
It was difficult.
and I'm sure we've got another one coming. Any more questions? Does that help?
Yeah, it helps quite a
Wait.
bit, and the thought about maybe changing their application sounds like a good approach. too.
Right, yeah.
I mean, at this point, there really is nothing that they could change that would be an easier path. It would only be if the land use code had some amendments coming out of there is gonna be some big areas of change for the use table and whatnot in the next I don't know, months, but it'll be a while before all of that is done, and it won't be just a piecemeal here and there. It'll be more like comprehensive updates, so.
With the general plan, you'd also change.
We're working on, the land use chapter is the one that we're in progress with right now, and there's kind of a conversation with the commission about what land use code updates need to actually be done even before the general plan gets updated, which is not ideal, but there's like an urgency to some of those, so yeah, those will all come about in a discussion with you guys soon.
I missed it when you said there's a master plan that was approved.
Just the affordable housing, yes, it is, yep. Okay, yep.
Thank you, Trish. And we have now one discussion item, which is the dark skies lighting requirements forthcoming amendments.
All right, so I'm gonna share my screen, and I don't have a lot of digging into this so far, but I've kind of just scratched the surface of what our current code looks like compared to some of the changes that the city has done. They adopted their revisions to their outdoor lighting requirements in December of last year. So we'll let Corey speak to that, but let me just share with you some of the initial things that we have here. Am I gonna be able to share? So in the purpose, there are quite a lot of items under purpose, and I think a lot of those were maybe a little redundant and also overreaching. So when you look at the city of Moab's, let's see if I can switch, if I can toggle here. Yeah, so they pared theirs down to 10 items, and I think they really do a little bit better job of kind of getting to the gist of what a lighting ordinance should be about. So I've kind of gone in and started to make some red lines to this, particularly, one of the big things that we really want to target, and what we've realized is one of the most egregious, violations or lighting disturbances is trespass, right? And that should be like one of the biggest focuses of this ordinance is light trespass. So when lighting is just glaring right onto your neighbor's property or right into their home, that's just a really basic thing that we can enforce. It's very enforceable in that. So that would be to protect against direct glare and excessive lighting. I took that from the city's ordinance. And then preventing direct light trespass kind of goes even further to specify that. And then the other thing that's really important is we have to balance that there's sufficient nighttime lighting for safety. So in the original ordinance, it just said improve nighttime lighting for safety, but really what we should be doing is ensuring that we have enough lighting for safety and that there's that balance between providing safety and then also, protecting our dark skies. So just rewording that a little bit. I think some of these other ones, like develop an attractive nighttime appearance in the county, that kind of seems to go under the facilitating, the potential for astrotourism and enhance the visitor experience, maintaining the rural atmosphere of the county. That seems to kind of capture the kind of preserving the attractive appearance of the county. And then preventing unnecessary and inappropriate outdoor lighting. I think that's a little bit vague and maybe a little hard to interpret. So that one I would propose striking that. And then also with the health risks, I don't know if we can really define those. I would have to do a little more research to confirm that. But to me, I think that we capture a lot of these other things in the purposes here. And then I liked what the city also provided as one of the purposes was to provide assistance to property owners and occupants to bringing non-conforming lighting into conformance with this chapter. So that kind of goes over the purposes. And then I'm just going to say just the overall gist of this ordinance, when it was adopted in 2019, mandated that in March, in 5 years from that time, which would be this coming month in 2024, that all non-conforming or uses or part of a non-conforming structure, sorry, that's the second part, that all exterior outdoor lighting installed after the effective date of this section in all zones shall conform to the requirements established by this section. And then there's the amortization schedule outlined in this section as well. So I was going to ask you, Corey, to kind of provide, if you could, just a summary of what changed in the city's ordinance, and especially in terms of this 5-year amortization schedule, and then anything else that you kind of want to highlight, that maybe the main takeaways of your experience going through that process at the city.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having Lexi and I on to provide a little bit of feedback. And we certainly in no ways want to dominate the conversation. We're here to help facilitate at least what our experience has been, some of our learned directions, and how we're trying to approach things over the last couple of years. And then with even within the adoption of this new ordinance, how it's been going since we've adopted them. But to kind of an overview perspective, if I might, I actually have a presentation recycled from the city council meeting where the ordinance was adopted. And I think that captures, in a way that I won't have to speak maybe as much. We can just use a few of these kind of key point materials, and then we can always dive into deeper discussion if needed within your guys' body of discussion. Let's see if I can toggle through. Perfect. Okay. So within our framework, which is fairly similar to that was adopted with the county, we've identified a couple key areas that were, through our processing over the last 4.5 years, hiccups to the effectiveness or the feasibility of executing this ordinance, because I think there was an intent to the ordinance, and then the actual practical aspects that weren't really vetted at the degree that they were installed within our code. So this is just the general framework, all the sections that we had, and had them broken down. So there were amendments, and I'm not sure if anyone had seen, other than maybe Mikkel, the specific red line document that we used, and it was significantly edited. But in that, a lot of the content really was the same. It was just refining it, polishing it up to a major degree. But what we were looking at, some of the major pieces were in how we were defining that language. So direct illumination and light spill, which then informs light trespass, like Elisa was saying, was also the city's #1 hurdle. How do we handle this? And to a regulatory degree, to do that best, you have to define out in a very understandable, specific, enforceable, and defensible way in order for that to execute appropriately. And what we found is in the previous ordinance, some of that language, when you were actually implementing that into plans and then into real life, just beyond what is our understanding of how we wanted dark skies to work, or even the intent, is once buildings are being constructed, where is that friction of once things are built and light isn't behaving like we thought it might? So editing those definitions, specifically direct illumination, as well. Safety lighting was something that we did look at, and that's something that IDA in general is evaluating as they've have a number of these communities coming online, is that putting in a static standard for amount of light for any particular size doesn't quite work. There are some properties that may not need as much light as they're allowed, and then they illuminate more than they need. Or conversely, there are properties that need legitimately, for safety, for circulation, all these very legitimate purposes, need an amount of light, but they're capped by kind of what is a TLO, total light output per property. So IDA is looking at really kind of stepping away from that effect, and Alexi might have more specific information on that. But what we did in the meantime, in order to execute for a total light output, was accommodate for these types of safety lightings being exempt, meaning they're verified and legitimized lighting that is required by some other standard, maybe not a land use code, but maybe it's requirements for street circulations or pedestrian circulations or building egress issues. Those types of lights are accommodated into that output. And then we also, this is something while we're here, is dealing with temporary lighting and temporary string lighting. Now, this was not an obligatory type of transition or something that was necessarily a major chafe, but is that these bistro lights, especially in the city, are something that obviously they throw and produce a lot of uplight. But weighing that to what is the community's desire, both on a residential and commercial platform, is we found a middle ground there where there would be acceptable times and locations for that type of lighting to be in use, but having that extinguished by a certain time to allow the night sky to be the night sky. So we weren't, what we were really trying not to do is make all illumination, eliminate all illumination. It is use light in the right locations and in the right ways for the right uses, and then allow the night experience to be the night experience. So it was a little bit of a compromise there. This is some imaging that we've used within our code. I believe it's even within the county's materials and certainly within Dark Skies materials. This was from Fort Collins, I believe, but published broadly through IDA. But even this is just kind of what I wanted to show is what kind of the understanding of light is for most folks. But even though this is an IDA promoted material, it's not correct. And no accusations, but the very basis of understanding how light behaves, it's stemming from this premise, therefore how direct illumination works, therefore how trespass can be regulated. So to show a little bit further, on this furthest left illumination, obviously it's full field. But as we go to this illumination, it seems to kind of cut off up at this 45-degree upward angle, but that's not actually correct because there's this illumination field. That illumination is illuminating this entire field up here. So this is really the only area that wouldn't be illuminated is immediately above that fixture. And then what we're seeing here, this is a horizontal plane of illumination by the figure, but really there is illumination actually going up. So this is a figure where this is the only qualifying fixture here. But this is how a lot of IDA materials, it's better, they're saying, yes, it is better, but it goes a little bit of a step further. And a way to demonstrate that, and this is actually imaging that Alexi was able to produce and installed into our code, but this is a light fixture actually from my home. It's a compliant fixture, both in temperature and in schedule. But you can see when I took up this picture, you can show really nicely that there is a horizontal plane coming off this light with a lower intensity field as well as a higher intensity field. I felt, when you put a flashlight up to a wall, everyone can replicate this experiment. But again, the purpose of identifying this and being able to define this is that there is still light emanating in this area. It's a reduced light, more or less than 10% lumen intensity, but it's there. So when we have, say, a neighbor and there's a light on their neighbor's home and they can observe that there is light coming into them, that's observable light, but that's by definition not glare. And this is where we're getting a lot of our pushback is folks were saying, I can see their light, therefore it's not dark sky, which is not correct. If we were to approach it from that perspective, is that you cannot have observable light that passes the property boundary, which is how the older code was designed. Essentially, you'd be unable to have any horizontal planed illumination, which is a compliant fixture, below an observable plane, meaning an individual's point of observation, which is also variable. A tall person would be able to see it maybe less, and a shorter person be able to see it more. But the point is that it doesn't matter how far away the building is, that horizontal plane extends perpetually forever. So again, this is a really critical point to how it is that we can define moving forward with what is, for me, the biggest aspect of this update. So again, just zooming in on this, this is what is kind of, you can see is the high intensity cone emanating from that light fixture, and then the lower intensity cone where it's obviously quite a bit more reduced, but it's still visible. And then this was a figure from an online source that really shows it quite well of what's happening between this illumination field, mainly to say that this is still a low intensity field. It's still there. With that being understood, we can really begin to move forward on how you would propose to regulate. Just moving really quickly through the rest of this, safety lighting, again, being something that can be exempt from the TLO, but not that you couldn't have all safety lighting and then still have extra. If you've watched any of our materials, we talk about it kind of as a cookies and carrots. Carrots obviously being the vegetables, the things that are good for you, cookies being an aesthetic bonus, kind of as you were. So if you're having a TLO, a total light output of 5,000 lumens per property or per some number of square footage or acreage, and your safety lighting eats up all of that TLO and exceeds it a little bit more, that would be acceptable through our ordinance now. But you would not be able to have all that, so 6,000 lumens per lot, and still have aesthetic lighting. Anything above the TLO can only be safety lighting, and everything below that can be safety lighting. So if the only way you're getting aesthetic lighting or lighting for the purpose of ambiance could be as if you're under that TLO amount. Temporary and stream lighting, again, we've exempted from the TLO. It has to be compliant with other aspects, or not the TLO, excuse me, but from the direct illumination component. So we have what we've bundled, and you'll hear about this with Alexi when she gets into our landscape ordinance, is this mechanism for an exemptions and exceptions processing procedures. That has been, in my mind, the best additions that we've had to both of those ordinances in order to accommodate for the unexpected, the subjective, where we have these properties that are unique, that have aspects that maybe don't comply with a general standard type of development. It gives the land use authority body the ability to review that in a criteria-based discussion and approve specific aspects of that exemption. So that's where some of this type of conversation might land. And then this just gets, again, into some of the specifics of the proposed amendments. I'm going to quickly go through here and see if there's anything else. Oh, yes. And this is, I think, getting to some of Elise's point, is that we've, in the city, developed what I've kind of coupled into what is a 1, 2, 3 punch. Punch being our effective points of enforcement or compliance as it works through the process. So amortization being the one that was prior existing in the ordinance. But what we've done now was originally promote a 1-2 punch. The first punch being this new adoption into special provisions that go into every zone, that it's an existing category under all of our permitted use sections that say for nuisances are not permitted for permitted uses, meaning odor. I think it even had already said glare in those, but it's noise, odor, cannot trespass outside the property. So that already existed. But what we have done with that is make nuisance lighting, that lighting that Elisa was talking about, that is the most flagrant and often most complained about, enforceable upon the approval of the ordinance, so that you're not needing to wait to a particular amortization date that's could be pretty far out, or even till a legal non-conforming turnover, or from a grandfathering perspective, waiting until that property redevelops. So it gives you immediate action on what is truly the most flagrant lighting. And there's an example that's after this next slide, but that's our punch 1. So that gives us immediate action. But then we also installed, which was going to be the total enforceable program. I felt it was the most legally defensive path, is to do these two things. is to incorporate it as a legal non-conforming provision, meaning if it's a nuisance lighting element, it's immediately enforceable. But if it's a aspect of the larger ordinance, meaning maybe temperature of your lights, it's not glaring at your neighbor, but it is the wrong temperature, or maybe you have too much throughout your property. Those are very much more structural types of improvements. It's not a matter of just putting it on a new bulb necessarily, maybe for temperature, but say you have illumination that is far over your total light output. That's going to take some significant reorganization to make sure that all your circulation, the egress paths are covered, but also reduce other lights. So those types of legal non-conforming aspects would only get kicked in upon a redevelopment of a site or any other provisions that you'd have within your legal non-conforming code or grandfathering code, kind of common term there. And then something near to the end of the development of the ordinance was the discussion of amortization, which I had proposed to eliminate. Ours was set at 5 years, which would have been on March. I think it would have been this month or this coming month. So we, is that right?
Yeah,
Anyway.
I think that's right.
Yeah, soon, less than a month. So anyway, we were coming to the end of that term, and we had nowhere near, for many, many reasons. I think through the pandemic and a multitude of reasons, the city's overall compliance had not progressed as much as I think we would have needed it to. And it was a significant liability. So the city opted to, rather than dismissing it, this amortization period, because again, through IDA, they require an amortization of the code. Now, when we spoke to the IDA associates, there's ways to handle that doesn't have to be what is an immediate termination date. So that language is to say that all lighting by this date must be 100% compliant or the property is in active violation. That's an immediate termination. IDA would have accepted by this date, this is the code that we require, and everything becomes legal non-conforming. That's how zoning typically works. We say, okay, forever, the building height has always been 30 feet, but you know what? We're deciding to go to 20 feet. We wouldn't say all buildings have to do structural amendments to bring them down to 20 feet on a certain date. Typically, we wouldn't do that. What we'd say is if you go to elect to redevelop your site, that is one of the first things that has to be amended, because you're voluntarily amending and putting financial aid into that property. Therefore, it should go to the things that are out of compliance. Standard zoning. Amortization is a much, much stronger tool that also has a double-edged capacity to it. So by setting that date, you're committing your whole community to whatever those provisions are. We've decided to extend that by another 5 years from the original date. So it's more or less 5 years and a little bit from now. So we've given a little bit more time, but we are still committing at that point. So we can see there, January 1st, 2029. What that unfortunately does to you though, and this is where other communities, even more locally, we've seen this, that will become a problem legally, and is something to keep in the back of your mind, is if you commit to the amortization period, yet you continue to amend that code, even if it's for a sense of improving it, you are changing the finish line. And an example of that, and this happened with our review, is we currently have a temperature of lighting restricted to 3000 K, which is the standard. I believe it's the same in the county. In the last 5 years, the city council was interested in potentially lowering that even further, lowering it to 2700 K. But what that would have done is all those properties that have come into compliance or were built concurrent with the code and built in compliance, basically meaning a lot of financial dedication to coming into compliance with the code, would have become non-compliant by this action. And the continued adjustment by a regulatory authority in that case keeps changing that finish line, where after a certain iteration, you're going to have people litigating you that they're putting unreasonable dedications to coming to compliance that they are never achieving. They're continuing to be out of compliance, even though they're attempting to. So we debated that is, do we want to leave it open and be able to continue to try to improve? Therefore, everything just continually becomes legal nonconforming, as do all of our zoning regulations. Or do we commit to this amortization and this is the goal. We're getting to 3,000K by 2029 and that's it. Even if we realize, hey, 3,000K isn't what we wanted, you're at legal liability at that point to some degree. And of course, it's only legal if somebody ever challenges. If nobody does, then you're not needing to be worried about it. But for my professional opinion, that was what I wanted the city council to be educated on that decision. So same to your bodies is be aware of the risk and reward that you're baking into your ordinances. But that's the 1, 2, 3 punch that we've maintained now. So we have an immediate term, a concurrent term, and then a finish line term. It's likely that in the next 3 to 4 years, we'll probably reevaluate the amortization period again to see how close we've come. I've warned about that as well. Is kind of a false threshold, if you will. That I think that the land use authorities need to be very aware of what it is they're encouraging, because it's a development cost, and as we all know from the state's perspective and particular lobby interests, municipal or local jurisdictional authority is under a lot of critique on exacerbating cost of development, which I don't subscribe to. I just don't believe that's true. You can develop whatever you want as long as it's within these parameters. But in certain instances, like the 2 ordinances we're discussing tonight, we could be, depending on how we approach these, adding costs. And we need to be very careful about that, is to not fall into some of the traps that could pull us into some criticism by these outside agencies. And so getting back to trespass lighting, just as this is probably, again, one of the major discussions that we're going to hear about. This is the number one lighting piece that we get complaints about. My neighbor has a floodlight on their garage and it shines into my bedroom. I'm sure staff at the county is more than familiar with this complaint as well. This is the type of lighting that, upon receiving a complaint, we'd go through a verification process to ensure that it is indeed in violation and then pursue that through a compliance case. But have basically given options that are very economical, as that it would be immediate, is that basically you have to immediately remedy the nuisance element. So if you're able to accommodate that by redirecting that light to an appropriate direction, or that direct illumination, that would be sufficient. If it's fixed and you're unable to do that, you would have to extinguish that light. But both of those are zero cost elements. So we're not telling you have to buy a new fixture. We're not telling you have to do anything else, but you have to eliminate what is that nuisance element. And again, legal nonconforming, like we're saying, it's either new construction or redevelopment that we're typically focusing on for that type of tool. And then amortization is the bigger goal, getting all of our community into compliance. So thank you for being patient through that, but hopefully that covers, the bigger body of what was being changed. Obviously, like I said, within the red line, it is a lot of material that was amended, but what hopefully that does is frame the bigger discussion pieces. I think direct illumination being the biggest amendment, kind of the tweak that we made to allow for the ordinance as a body to work. It could have been debated and has been debated that what was actually installed in the ordinance prior was infeasible. As well as the amortization, which Elisa had brought up, is kind of one of the bigger considerations your body's looking at tonight. So super happy to dive back into anything else, but hopefully that spurs a little bit of discussion.
Thank you so much, Corey. Just, you want to open it up for questions, or?
Yeah, is there any questions?
I actually had one, just follow-up question. I thought I heard you say that the IDA would certify you even if you didn't do the amortization. If you just had the non-conforming language in there, that would be okay as well for IDA to certify.
Sure. In a simple response answer is yes. Having an amortization date is required by the checklist in order to be certified. But what that amortization means can be well, two tools. We'll call it two to kind of pare it down. Is it amortization can be immediate termination, which is what I was saying. Everything has to be compliant by a certain date, or your amortization can simply be by this date, everything becomes legal non-conforming, and everything that is new, developed, or whatever provisions you want have to come up into compliance within your existing provision standards. So
Okay.
you do need amortization, but what that means can be, for the
Different,
sake of argument, two different things.
right?
One
Okay.
being, very severe, one being a little bit more standard.
Got it. Thanks for that clarification. Does anybody else have any follow-up questions for Corey?
I had one. Question about signage. Is that addressed in this ordinance or in this proposal?
It is.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, there's some new provisions that IDA came out with as they've had an evolving checklist, which has also been a struggle of both the county and city staff. Is every year we try to catch up to the criteria, and they've added a few things, but they have added some sign material. So we've come up into compliance with that, and essentially is that you have to have a lumen cap for your signage now as well. And they had two options with that. One was a lumen calc, which we opted to do, and the others was a NITS reading. And I won't go into the complexity of that, but it spoke to the fact that a lot of this is being designed under maximizing the idea or the intent of dark sky, but in practicality, that is an example of how that doesn't work in real life. Because what that would have required is a property to install a sign, extinguish all perimeter signs or even the perimeter lighting that could have interfered with the reading, and then have a physical reading of what is the reflective amount of light coming off of that sign, which in a vacuumous lab is doable. But in reality, you've just had somebody install, develop, and produce signage that we won't be able to have in a laboratory setting. So it's, when we spoke to them, we kind of pointed all these factors out, and they're like, oh yeah, I guess we didn't think about it that way. And that's not to diminish IDA's purpose. Their purpose is to push that envelope and to continue to push it. But what I think, as a professional staff person that is trying to install all these regulatory elements that the bodies, our land use authority groups, are looking to push, is to tell you, be an advocate for you that this, this will work or this won't work, or you're going to have troubles with this. So that was one of those areas that your staff can work with IDA to kind of get to terms with what would be acceptable. I think we found something that was more or less, it met their criteria, but it was staying away from some of the more progressive, inaccessible options that we had.
Right. Yeah, a lot of this really comes down to enforceability. Again, like with the landscaping ordinance we'll be talking about in a minute. That's the kind of one of the big picture things, is how we always have to be thinking about our code compliance officer. We have one, and he's busy. So we have to think about how we can make it realistically enforceable. But yeah, thank you, Corey, so much. That was super informative. And we'll just be diving into this and probably checking in with you along the way.
Sounds
So,
good.
All right.
Great. And I guess no other questions. We're going to do citizens to be heard. If there's anyone in the audience or online who wants to talk on a topic for about 3 minutes maximum. Without
Being anything to do with the landscaping ordinance, because that would be part of the workshop.
Nope. There is no one then for that part. And future considerations, do we have any? What we're going to do is, the reason I'm doing it in this order is we are going to end the meeting and then do the workshop. So any future considerations? Okay. Do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Adjourned. I'll move to adjourn.
Going live with this.
Sorry. Okay. Tony moved and Jerry seconded. Okay, all in favor? So the meeting now is adjourned at about 5:15. And we're gonna go into workshop mode. Lisa.
All right. There we go. Okay. So, we've taken all the main points that we put in that staff report and just put them in slides so we can go through. So I would just say to the public, as we go through these topics, I don't know, OB, if you agree with this, but having folks come up and speak in the mic if they can. I mean, it's not super critical because we're in a workshop setting. I don't think we necessarily have to have everybody recorded with their comments, but if you want to come up to the table or just come closer, we can hear your comments as we go through these different topics. It's just totally up to you or whenever you feel the urge. So the whole background, like why we started this, we'd had an idea of doing a landscaping ordinance for a while, but then we got information about the Utah Water Savers Landscape Incentive Program, which is a rebate program for landowners. And that really kind of made it more urgent so that we could be eligible as a community to offer existing residences this rebate program, basically to reduce some of the turf on their property and then get paid for it by the state. So there are some minimum requirements for that, and those are here. We've already gone through this quite a lot. Those minimum requirements are pretty basic. But this was an opportunity to really look into going further and ensuring that we have something that really gets to the heart of water conservation and making sure that we're not, kind of using too much culinary water for landscaping purposes and that kind of thing. So when we had this topic at the last planning commission meeting, when we brought it up in November, there were some main takeaways from that. And one of them was that we were probably going to have some differences from what the city adopted. They did their landscaping ordinance recently. But the city has some very different characteristics in that it's a much more urban kind of setting. There's a lot smaller lots usually. And in the county, we have these large 1 acre lots to 2 acres, sometimes even 5 acres. And in the commercial zoning districts, those lots are very large. So we kind of have to be thinking about how there's also like the rural character and a lot more going on in terms of probably agricultural type uses. So we wanted to be thinking about how we're going to be different than the city in that regard. But there were a lot of lessons that we could take from the city's ordinance. So we did use that as kind of a taking off point. So let's see, we have to simplify the requirements of the ordinance, making it easier for users. So we've definitely wanted to try to keep this not to be too complex for the typical landowner to follow and not get too far in the weeds with our regulation. Trying to be more prescriptive, is it the right word? Less prescriptive, thank you. Get that flip-flopped. And then erring on the side of education and requirements for small developments and renovations rather than complex requirements. The use of the ordinance to encourage homeowners to actually develop a familiarity with their natural landscape, like actually looking around and seeing where the natural drainage might be and how they can kind of support its natural functions through natural vegetation. So one of the next steps that we had, so Katie Murphy, our Vista, has been working a lot on this. And so I'll let you just talk about your interview process.
Sure. So in order to get as wide a range of opinions as possible on this and really delve into some of the science and the specifics related to this area that would inform proper regulations on this ordinance, I spoke to a number of specialists. I'm not going to list everybody, but I had several people coming from a landscaping perspective, more of a sort of permaculture perspective, thinking about soil composition, water retention, some folks who are experts in native plants, some folks who are coming more from a wildlands perspective, conservation perspective, and a few folks from WISA, thinking about balancing questions of maximization of ecosystem services, so to speak, which is often a big part of permaculture in terms of how do we transform the land to a certain extent, or you could say regenerate the land in places where it has been damaged, or from a more conservation oriented perspective, in places that haven't been so damaged, how do we sort of retain the character and the functions that are happening there? So it was a little bit of a dance between those perspectives.
And I would say, to piggyback on that, all of those things that Katie just mentioned go towards water conservation ultimately, because if you have all of those elements working properly, then your land is not sucking up as much water.
I wanted to add earlier, just I think it's important to remember too that although this landscape, the center of this landscape ordinance is about water conservation, there are also really important other functions that are helpful in landscaping in terms of combating climate change and the public health risks related to climate change, cooling functions, retaining stormwater, cleaning stormwater, improving the quality of soil, reducing dust. All these things can be accomplished through landscaping techniques.
Nice. So we kind of came up with, or Katie did a really good job of this and through her interview process, and then kind of going through a few of our staff meetings to work out sort of our organizing principles. So addressing the ecosystemic diversity of the county with Omernick ecoregions, which I'll let you describe and kind of you can take us through these actually. Sure. These are more here.
So something that I came across as I was working backwards from the city's ordinance is that the city is, for the most part, in a relatively ecosystemically homogeneous area. There's a lot of, generally the landscapes within the city are within a similar, have similar sets of plants that are native to there, or that are able to survive, similar soil composition, similar moisture content in the soil. So it's relatively similar conditions. So it makes sense to have some sort of sweeping regulations in the city. In the county, I think it's necessary to create a little bit more nuance, so that we're not having a one size fits all ordinance that might just really be inappropriate to certain ecosystems. So talking a little bit with Tony, I came up with this idea of Omernick ecoregions as a classification system for ecological zones with sort of reference communities of plants and animals, soil typology, hydrology. And obviously this is all coming from a really complex set of, scientific information, but working on how to pare that down to a set of easy to communicate set of information that we can show people in the landscape manual, and then some easy questions for them to figure out where they are in the Omernick ecoregion. And that's one of the more basic things that we want everybody to figure out, even these sort of small landowners, in order to understand their land. Additionally, fire safe landscape requirements for fire prone areas. Fire safe landscape requirements can be pretty particular and may not always be the best in every situation, in terms of there's a lot of reduction of plant matter, and in a lot of places that is sort of contrary to some of the goals in the ordinance. And so it was important, I think, to figure out where these requirements were absolutely necessary and where they weren't. And I'm still working on that, but we're gonna have a map from the Utah DNR of fire prone areas and have a separate set of additional requirements for folks who are within those areas. Riparian areas, there's a lot of organizations and agencies that it's useful to get permission for. The DNR, the Division of Water Rights, the Fish and Wildlife, Army Corps of Engineers, et cetera. So it's pretty easy to kind of farm those regulations out there and just say you have to contact these entities if you're within the 100-year floodplain of a perennial stream. And then something else that's was a sort of keystone of trying to figure out how to create nuance in this ordinance was distinguishing between quote unquote disturbed and undisturbed areas, which is debatably a complex distinction and one that's not necessarily easy to define, but is important to define in that if you have a landscaped area that really hasn't had a lot of impact to it, things are going to function really quite differently than in a place that has been grazed for generations, for example. And there are things that are maybe helpful to require for conservation in terms of a place that hasn't been disturbed too much, has a lot of intact functions going on, as opposed to those requirements really wouldn't make quite the same amount of sense for already disturbed area. And in already disturbed areas, there may actually be interventions that are helpful that we want to encourage. So we decided to define this based on property history. We figured that was the easiest way for people to understand. So if an area has been paved, graded, built upon, or vegetation has been removed in the past, then it's considered disturbed. And if none of those things are the case, it's considered undisturbed. And definitely interested if folks have thoughts on how to nuance that definition more, feel free, but we want to make it relatively easy for people to figure out whether it's disturbed or undisturbed. And we're still needing to draft exactly what is allowed and not allowed for areas that are undisturbed. We don't want to make it so that you just can't touch or do anything, but we do want to preserve the intent of conservation. Whereas disturbed areas we'll get into later have some relatively specific requirements related to maintaining ecosystemic functions and public health functions.
Yeah, so the disturbed area is important because that's really the gist of the entire, like all the requirements are going to be in your disturbed area. The undisturbed area is kind of exempt because that's just natural habitat vegetation. So that's where we're kind of drawing the line in defining disturbed versus undisturbed. So I kind of want to hear, before we go to the next topic, if anybody has comments on these kind of organizing principles or.
I actually had a question about exactly this part.
Okay.
That question is, in the disturbed areas, I think you've got a good list of things that need to be done, but one of the things I didn't see on any of the stuff in here is some type of, I guess it'd be remediation that would bring a disturbed area back to its undisturbed state.
Right.
I would think that would probably be, you know, depending on where it actually is, that might be a desirable thing to do.
Yeah, so that's actually, I think that's something we just assumed would be an option for people to revegetate or rehabilitate the land back to its natural state as part of the landscaping plan that they would implement. Like where they could say, oh, instead of planting all these things that kind of barely make the plant list, we're going to actually go back and plant like native vegetation. And that would be bringing that area basically to an undisturbed state, which, yeah, would work. But I think we could explicitly say that a little bit better in there as an option.
I think so.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, the preferred or a preferred option is to bring the disturbed areas back to their native state.
Right.
To add to that, the way that I was thinking about the requirements that we have for disturbed areas was sort of, instead of saying something about a revegetation or bringing something back to an undisturbed state, because it's very difficult to define an undisturbed state. It's much more easy to define a disturbed state or to define an ideal state for a particular area, especially after it's had a long history of disturbance. And so we were more erring towards describing what sort of ecosystemic functions. So we're talking about drainage. We're talking about how much water is infiltrating. We're talking about whether certain species of animals and plants are able to survive on that land and sort of defining that way more as opposed to an ideal end state. But I mean, ideally, these requirements would approximate that.
Yeah, I guess my thought was more along the lines of, if you look at a construction site, a lot of stuff gets.
Just graded,
Yeah,
scraped.
It
Yeah.
gets disturbed, right? And usually the further away you get from the actual construction site, the less and less it gets disturbed, but there's vehicles and, machinery that tracks across things. And I think to the extent possible, it would be preferred just to get it back to natural state. A lot of it you could recover pretty quick.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that comment.
I would only comment that I really like these organizing principles, this idea that we have kind of different ecoregions. It seems very educational for people, no matter, how many requirements we have. It tells people that you're living in a different area and here's things you ought to be aware of, and here's native plants you might plant there, or that you're in a place that you need to worry about fire-wise or fire-safe, planting and how far things are away. So I really liked this kind of educational thing.
I will jump in very shortly and to respectfully dissent from the one thing you said there, Jerry. It's landscape restoration is oftentimes doable in the Pacific Northwest or in the United States Southeast. The soil types and vegetation types that we have specifically in Grant County are incredibly sensitive to disturbance. And as someone who ostensibly is paid full-time to think about restoring desert landscapes, I can tell you for a fact that there's no such thing as an entirely restored desert landscape. They do not come back, period. They don't. There's things you can do to mitigate them. But, when you scrape the black brush ephedra off the steps through this red sand, you're not going to get a 300-year-old black brush ephedra ecosystem back there by planting one and watering it for 10 years. So we're going to need, that's, I think, a thing we should keep in mind here is that we got to get serious about what disturbed means in our part of the world, because listening to the ASCE is not going to get us the correct measures for what we
Good
That's
point.
all, just my piece.
That's good, Tony.
And I'm for the record, the wildlands and wildlife habitat bias on this list, and I'll acknowledge it straight up. And I know that it's gonna be a compromise. That's just my piece.
Can I actually specifically ask Tony, what you think about, the definition that we came up with of disturbed based on past land use?
That's the bullet number 5. Sorry.
Yeah, so it's just under D, I think is what you're talking about, defining based on property history.
I think I have that sheet.
Yeah, this is different than that.
Oh, this is different than the staff report.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've been reading off the staff report the whole
Oh,
time.
that's okay.
And the staff report.
It's subject to a minimum guide plant material, plant list, drainage requirements. That's
Oh, yeah, it's number 5.
Number 5, yeah. Yep.
disturbed is native vegetation and native habitat. Disturbed is ground that has grading, development, or alteration. That I think is a fairly consistent standard. I'm thinking about painting with a broad brush and what kind of triggers oftentimes cross thresholds which require some sort of ecological analysis and surface disturbance. Soil surface disturbance oftentimes pulls that lever for floodplain development, for archaeological protection, for the Endangered Species Act. When you start scraping the dirt, that usually pulls the lever. So I think you're on the right track there.
Great, thank you.
I guess, Tony, to your point, I get it. That's something that's 300 years old, that's gone, isn't coming back overnight. But when I look at this, what I see is, in a disturbed area, you want me to put something there. And I guess my point is, maybe that's not the best thing.
I think that often, I'm gonna have to acknowledge again that there's gonna be a level of compromise because I would immediately go to the level and nature of the disturbance. You know, just hypothetical opposite ends of the spectrum. There's the anthracite. You don't get more disturbed than that, you know? And then there are some parcels of winter range out on the big flat that really, there is a level of disturbance there, but it's a pretty wild landscape still that has a lot of ecosystem functions. So I don't think there's much appetite for that level of nuance and having a 300-page rule book in the ordinance. And I don't know if I can propose any specific resolution there.
Yeah, something we can keep an open mind about. Do we want to have a member of the public have an opportunity? Okay,
If they'd like to comment on this particular issue where we are now.
yeah, or if you wanted to wait, okay. Then I was gonna actually ask Alexi or Corey, if you wanted to chime in at this point as well in terms of kind of any takeaways from the city's process on organizing the overarching principles.
Sure. I think a lot of these sound like a good place to start. And as you mentioned, the city has different considerations with a lot of the properties. So while we did look at fire landscapes in the DNR maps, they weren't as applicable to the city. So it made more sense for us to label them somewhere for people to reference as opposed to make requirements specifically about them. So while these are somewhat different, I think it's a good place to start with knowing what your goals are, because that's what drove a lot of our process as well. Just trying to identify that we wanted to manage dust or increase shade in the city, and then trying to build our ordinance around the things that we were pursuing. Corey, did you want to add anything?
Maybe not at this time, and so you wanted to maybe get into specifics of the framing, but yeah, we can maybe circle back at that point. It still sounds like we're in the bigger perspective.
Yeah, okay, we can keep moving here and then we'll take some pauses and let you guys chime in. So, of course, we gotta consider enforcement, as we were talking about before, in all of this. We've really tried to draft the ordinance so far to be enforceable. We've really been keeping that in mind as we go through and create the standards and regulations. So I think we've done a pretty good job so far. I think there are some things that are in the kind of the main sticking points that we can talk about that might be difficult if we wanted to include those. They might be difficult to enforce, but we can talk about that. So to like what degree, in what circumstances will existing developments be required to come into compliance? That's one of those. Right now we have the threshold for compliance is set at if an existing property increases impermeable surface by more than 20%, then these properties would be required to come into compliance. And then the question we're asking is, would they need to come into compliance with with the full ordinance, or would there be a separate set of standards that might not be as just a lower bar, basically, a more realistic bar for existing properties? Because as you know, this is an ordinance that would be in place that would affect new development only, unless there was an existing property that was changing their use or intensifying their use. And this would be included with the pulling a building permit per se, that would increase the impermeable surface of the lot by more than 20%. So building a structure or paving.
That was my question. It's more than 20% of the lot size or more than 20% of the existing impermeable surface?
I think it would be so taking the entire impervious surface of the lot and then increasing that by 20%.
Okay. Existing
I believe.
impermeable.
Is that right?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah.
That was just a little.
I guess, just to add to that, so I think that there are some things in this ordinance that would be tricky with enforcement to bring existing developments into compliance. So I think it is important to look at ways that we might make that easier on ourselves and also easier on the public, by increasing a threshold. The question is whether that threshold for compliance will be, increasing the threshold and then having them come into compliance with the entire ordinance, or leaving the threshold the same and having them come into compliance with specific aspects of the ordinance.
Can I throw out an idea there?
Yeah.
I don't know if the city is empowered to like weigh in on this aspect of it, but would it be possible for folks who voluntarily come into compliance with the entirety of the ordinance to be prioritized for assistance from the WaterWise grant program from the state? Whereas if you only partially come into compliance, as may be your option, you are not as prioritized. Is there a way to?
I wonder.
I don't know if that's
Yeah.
a legal idea. It just literally popped in my head, but there you go.
Yeah, it would be probably working with the state to their program to find out how they process those requests.
Are those requests routed through the county and then up?
No,
They're not.
I think they're just direct with the
Interesting.
state agency.
Gotcha.
So we can circle back to this. This is kind of a big picture item, but something to be thinking about. So getting into some of our main sticking points. One of the things that we want to kind of take the temperature on with you guys is for existing and future turf intensive uses where we have facilities such as schools, athletic areas, cemeteries, golf courses, parks, public recreation facilities. Those are traditionally very turf intensive. So right now, the current ordinance as written, a lot of those uses going like for new development of these uses. So if somebody wanted to put in a new golf course, that wouldn't be possible in their traditional form, just with whatever grass they wanted to plant and a certain acreage. So, but there are differences, of course, between public facilities and private development. So I think those are some tricky things to kind of decipher how we want to exempt some things and not others, but definitely an important aspect of this ordinance. Whoops. So let's see, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just to add to that, there's a couple options for ways that we could think about that. So as the ordinance is currently written, a lot of those uses, you would just not be able to make a new golf course under the current ordinance unless we create an exemption for that. There are some other things that we could potentially create partial exemptions that, these, if you want to make a new golf course, this is the way it has to be done. For example, it has to be irrigated with non-culinary water, either secondary or reclaimed or gray water. And I think currently we have an element in the draft that may come out, may not, that's sort of like reserved, that says all turf applications over 10 acres need to use some type of non-culinary water. Of course, that only stays in if there's some kind of an exemption that would allow those facilities to be created in the first place, because currently it wouldn't matter.
And so in the state requirements, we believe that those facilities are exempted from the requirements.
I think so. I need to look a little bit closer, but
think I
there's some
remember
kind
that
of an exemption. I don't know if it's a full exemption or not.
Right. And then the other thing is, I was curious because we were having this conversation just before the meeting of, I can't even imagine if like Swanee Park, for example, how is Swanee Park watered? What's the water coming from? It can't be culinary, is it?
I'm pretty sure it is.
Alexi or Corey, do you know?
I don't know what other water they have.
Oh, you're muted, Alexi. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with its water source. I know
Okay.
we have like Old City Park, which has a spring, which is different. But it does have at least a traditional irrigation system. We're experimenting with trying to get something a little more efficient than what's currently out there. And we started water audits this fall. And the reason why we did exempt some of these public recreation areas, things like that, was just because if turf is restricted in people's yards and there's only so many ways you can use it, it makes public shared spaces that much more important if you have sport events or things like that, that you would need to use turf for.
That makes a lot of sense. And so Old City Park is coming from a secondary water source, a spring essentially, for their watering irrigation.
I believe they are. I can confirm that, but there is spring water out there that I believe is used for irrigation purposes. It is separately metered and on the state website.
Okay, yeah, and then I wonder too about the cemeteries, because I know from firsthand experience that the cemetery water system is pretty outdated. The sprinklers, oh my goodness, they really need to look at that.
So Ben said they're on secondary.
They are on secondary water. On Spanish Valley Drive, but then I wonder about the one in town that would have to be culinary. Interesting. That's a lot of culinary water going towards that. Okay, so those are things we wanted to highlight with this topic. And then we have the second main sticking point, which is personal livestock. So should exemptions exist for the cultivation of pasture plants, we're talking about plant species that are not approved on the plant list that you're growing in your pasture for your personal livestock. So should there be exemptions to the plant list so that those plant species could be cultivated for this purpose? Or would they just have a full blanket exemption from the ordinance? So many of those who have personal livestock also have water rights. So they're watering their pastures with their secondary water already. So that's already a good thing. But, that water is still coming from the aquifers, and we don't know all about that. And I know this is where you're going to be weighing in. However, the ordinance does not we don't limit in the ordinance the use of your water right. It's just the type of plants that would be grown. So I'll let you go first, Tony. Or do you want to go?
I think you were
I can speak about
Okay,
that.
Of course, please.
And I'm here, I am on the Grand Water Board. I have been for about 13 years, lived here about 18 years. Excuse me. So I have a pasture. I have animals, livestock, sheep, alpaca, goats. I used to raise sheep. I did it commercially. I no longer do it commercially. I no longer sell their fiber. There are many, many people in Spanish Valley who are in the same situation I am. They have horses or other animals as well. Everyone I know has a secondary source of irrigation. Either Kinslake water, which I have, a well, which I also have, or secondary irrigation system. Most of us are on rural residential zoned land. And if you look at the definition of that, each property within a certain amount of acreage is allowed a certain amount of animals. You have to have forage grass for those animals to eat. Native grass does not work. I've tried it. I have it. It doesn't work. So I think that personal livestock, anyone on rural residential land, anyone with secondary water of any sort should be fully exempt from this. They're not using, by the way, someone said they use the aquifer. Kinslake water, well water, secondary irrigation system does not use the Glen Canyon aquifer. That is where our culinary water is coming from. So that's the main thing that I have an interest in protecting as a member of the public, as well as being on Grand Water Board, is our Glen Canyon aquifer.
maybe Daryl mentioned the pasture mix that IFA sell, maybe mention that.
Well, there are ways that people can reduce their water use. I took Trish and Katie on a tour and showed them, first of all, my pasture, I use mostly drought tolerant pasture grass. It is forage grass. Some of it is not entirely drought tolerant. Some of it, orchard grass, for example, is not drought tolerant, but there are many fescues, rye, and different types. IFA is a good example of a company that sells one called the Moab Mix, which is especially good for our climate here. So I'm not saying that everybody should use that. It may not work for every kind of animal, but I think it's an idea that from an educational standpoint, Katie has done a great job with compiling some educational material here. That's the kind of educational material that should be provided to people who do want to have a pasture.
I was going to essentially reiterate exactly what you already said. There's a nuance to the animal husbandry side of the conversation that landscaping, water-wise landscaping ordinance doesn't quite fit. That's where I sit, bottom line. You mentioned different species, you have sheep, horses, cows. There are native plant mixes. The composition of what we call the vegetated mosaic, the different mixture of plants out on the field, depending on whether or not you have native grasses and shrubs versus forage grasses and shrubs, is going to substantially impact your stocking rate and the amount of AUMs you'll be able to have on a pasture. That is not necessarily the same thing as making water-wise landscaping choices. Now you're talking about severely putting a severe restriction on the bottom line of the agricultural center of our community.
So I want to make a distinction because we do actually exempt, this maybe could have been worded better on the slide, but we do exempt in the ordinance livestock that is for food, basically. But for personal livestock that's
Commercial applications.
and commercial for sure. Yeah, commercial's blanketed exempt for sure. But I think we were thinking about the situation where you have livestock that are essentially like, I don't want to say this in the wrong way.
The hobby horse.
Yeah. Uh-huh. So.
Well, Sam Cunningham and I both, she still sells her fiber to Desert Thread. It provides an economic benefit to this town.
Yeah, that's.
She does, hers is commercial now. That's what I used to do.
Right.
I don't now. And once again, it's not using culinary water. None of that is using culinary water. And it's my understanding that the primary focus of this whole ordinance is to protect our culinary water. And I think a lot of people have heard me talk about this, at least at the groundwater meetings. We have some people using enormous amounts of culinary water. We have 750 people on our top tier using from 8 households worth to 50 households worth of water each all summer long for 4 months in the summertime, water on their lawns and their gardens. And that's another point I'm going to make about this ordinance. If you're using culinary water on a garden, even if it's edible, even if it's for your own edible purposes, I know someone who is using 3 to 4 households worth of water on his garden, which he uses for vegetables and fruit and things like that. Wonderful, but it's culinary water and we don't get that back once it's been used. And it doesn't go back into the Glen Canyon aquifer. It goes into the Valley Fill aquifer, which cannot be used for culinary water in the future because of its high dissolve solids and heavy metals.
That was the very first thing I said when the Waterwise landscape ordinance came up a year ago. Ripping out sod in favor of tomatoes is not a wise use of water.
Right.
It is more water intensive to have your salsa garden than your lawn. Hands down.
To speak particularly to that issue, one update that we've made, Dale, since the version that you saw, is that now there originally was a blanket exemption for personal agriculture, which is now only an exemption from the plan list. So a lot of the requirements about, water waste is not allowed, those sorts of things also now apply to personal agriculture.
Right, that's a good point. So I don't know, Alexi and Corey, if you guys had any of this conversation on the city level, you probably had a little bit.
Yes, less so about livestock, although we do have fowl for food production exempt. But there are a few things in there that are. Some of the things though, like we were talking about cemeteries, golf courses, those sorts of things, we still the irrigation system requirements apply. So the idea being in some cases, maybe the same limits aren't appropriate for that type of use, but it's still applicable to irrigate or use water efficiently when you are using water. And something else worth considering too is that in some cases, secondary water can have more particulate matter in it, making some irrigation systems difficult to use. So that would depend a lot on somebody's property and the way it's set up, but it would be useful perhaps for some people to have a way to get an exception if they're set up to use culinary and that's the way to most efficiently use their water. Although obviously there are considerations of whether you're using culinary versus secondary and which types of water you're trying to conserve.
Can I ask a question about this really quickly?
Yes.
As far as culinary water versus alternate sources of water for personal gardens and things like this, I'm thinking of my own garden and several other people I know, right? We have fruit trees, we have raised beds, we have all these things going on. Is there an easy way to like provide an alternative water source to people?
Are you in the county?
Oh, I guess I'm in the city. That's why.
Yeah, so it's a conversation that's being had though. I mean, there's a lot of energy behind this idea of there needs to be a secondary water source for irrigation, gardens, watering lawns or whatever in the city. Doesn't have that currently, but it could be like it's a conversation that's being had. I don't know if Ben needs to.
We're also coming back to that in a few slides.
Oh, yeah. Ben, do you have anything to say at this point at this juncture? No pressure. I just want to give you a chance if you do have anything you want to add.
Well, I have a lot of comments. I just prefer to interject.
Well, why don't you come up and join the conversation, because I don't think we necessarily have to go in order. This is a kind of a long slideshow and I don't want to hold you up if you want to get out of here. I know you do.
Some of it's water related, some of it's just my personal thoughts, but how closely does the landscape ordinance follow the uses of the land in your own zoning code? And I don't hear good, huh? Some of the stuff I told them before, it reads like you're making Grand County an HOA.
We don't want that.
If my plant died, I have 30 days to replace it. Somebody's telling me when I have to add mulch to my land, regular watering, who decides that? What's regular? We've gone through a lot of notes, and ultimately, from our standpoint, we approached the county about this, and I know they had it in their mind, but was to enable people to reduce their turf. There's 3 requirements for that. There's 3 lines, and we have a 9-page ordinance to cover those 3 lines. I know you have other ideas and and things, but
Right, and I should say, we did pare down the draft since you've seen it. We've really pared it down. And we've taken things out that were, because at first, Katie was kind of like, let's just kind of put everything that's out there that we can possibly consider, and then start taking stuff away that doesn't make sense. And so we've started to do that now, and some of the things that we took away, we put back in the presentation or the staff report to kind of discuss whether or not we should have left that in there, or but like for instance, what was the one first thing that he was talking about? That's
Replacing dead plants is not
Oh,
in there
that's not in there.
anymore.
yeah, and the mulch is only an option for a ground cover, if you want to choose that as a mix of ground cover.
Which is particularly tied to reducing dust. And so the idea is to reduce the amount of fugitive dust that would potentially be coming off the land through a variety of methods, one of which would be using mulch. And we discussed this during our meeting, but one thing that Dale brought up later, which I've been trying to think about how to integrate, is the fact that mulch blows away really easily, especially in Spanish Valley. There's a lot of wind, and we did have a limit, which we still have in there, on the amount of inorganic ground cover like gravel, and that's because inorganic ground cover can function in terms of the heat island effect. So we wanted to limit that, but potentially we could change that percentage.
Well, two things on that. Number one, and I see your point there. Certainly, it's wonderful to have more organic. But I took everyone out to see a friend's house who has a little lawn, which was grama and then turned into fescue grass, because that's what happens around here. That does not provide much cooling for their neighbor next door or across the street. So, and there are many, our population, 30% of our population here in the county, at least, I believe, and maybe all of Moab, is over 60 years old. A lot of people would just prefer to have straight desert landscape with a lot of gravel and less native or any other type of grass. A few plants that are easy to maintain. Some people do, and I think we need to consider that as well, maintenance of this whole thing.
For sure. Go ahead, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I tried to scribble down those metrics about ground cover. I understand how the arithmetic on that would work. This is one reason why I emphasized teaching people how to use Armordic ecoregions, because there is no amount of water that you can put on some lots in Thompson Springs to achieve 75% ground cover. Even with the gravel and the organics, you're going to just like, Grand County is mostly a heat sink, and that is its natural wild habitat. So we need to understand that if we are trying to conserve water in Grand County, planting more plants and causing more decomposition and more biological oxygen demand and creating more need for water in places where water usually transports down to the Colorado River, right? This reads to me like permaculture, which is not actually, like in my humble opinion, I'm going to piss off a lot of my friends, not actually tenable in this community when we're talking about landscape conversion. We're in the city, this makes a little bit more sense, but we're going to be throwing this at people in Thompson Springs. We're going to be throwing this at people at the upper edges of Castle Valley, where if you've got one stem for every 3 yards, you're talking about a pretty vegetated spot. So I am cautious.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I've had that in the back of my mind when we were going through setting these numbers, and they're really quite, I mean, they're not arbitrary necessarily, but we had to start somewhere to kind of work out what it would actually look like if we Originally it was set at 90% ground cover, and I can't remember
Which came from the city.
that was the cities, and so we're looking at much larger lots, so we thought, well, let's just go see what happens if you put it at 75%. And so that's where we got these numbers for minimum square feet for, what would have to be covered with living plants, which is 30% of the acreage, the disturbed area. And maximum of that could be inorganic ground cover. So gravel could be used there, and then the remaining square footage would need to be organic ground cover. So I do think that this is something we have to be thinking about in terms of the different regions, like Thompson and up in the mountains, and it's going to change based on the region for sure. And I also think that if you're talking about planting plants that are not just a straight up native vegetation, then you are possibly in going to be requiring more water. But the plant list is supposed to be designed to kind of encourage plant life that would be more drought tolerant and more adapt to not being watered so much.
In a lot of places in our county, a greater than zero amount of new plants is more water use than no plants.
Yeah.
That's it is accounting. I mean, Ben can tell you about water accounting. That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
Often,
But I would, oh, go ahead.
often there's also just like the introduction period where you're watering this, and it's not necessarily a lifelong commitment. When you're replacing, landscaping or other objects with native plants, you have to get them started because you're starting from, dust bowl. And so you place a native plant, it needs that initial watering schedule for a few months, maybe up to a year to get it established. And then often it's able to maintain itself with the normal water cycles of our ecosystem. But
right, I'm just thinking about water conservation and water delivery on the macro scale. And landscape conversion is landscape conversion, bottom line. There are areas here where like the natural habitat, the natural composition of the landscape here, less than 25% gravels, the soil is gravel. Like I'm struggling with it. Just I don't want to double down on this, but I mean, like, less than 25% gravels. The city of Moab is a riparian zone. Most of Grand County is black brush ephedra. If you get some snow, you might be in the pinyon juniper woodland, right? Over here.
Oh, well, I was only going to say, it is this interesting thing because some folks, myself included, I'm happy there's some agricultural land in Spanish Valley that's in our county, and it is watered. It's desert. It produces food. Parks are important. They use more water. You could probably have very little water use and a bunch of residents and import food and have a very different community. So whatever we come up with, I think needs to have water for people who are doing agricultural purposes, even water for people who are planting native plants. We're guilty. We live out in Castle Valley, and 2 acres are probably native plants and 13 or 14 different local grasses, etc. Makita's right. Once you get it started, we still do a little bit of water on it in a groundwater system. I think these places are important, and I don't want to lose sight of. We don't just want to save water so we can grow our population.
Sure.
And
that's a really good
I will then once again use this word resilience. If you decide you're going to, gravel things over, save water, and then you overshoot in population, you don't have any easy way to cut back and support the people that you have. So I think it's a very kind of interesting, complicated issue.
It does get complicated for sure. Alexi does have her hand up, so let her speak.
Yeah, there were a couple of things that we were considering with the city that might be adaptable if you think they're applicable. One is that we did delineate, we have a difference between a required landscape, which in our code is 70% of your front yard and your side, like street adjacent side yard. So we have different requirements for the required landscape. And then if you choose to landscape more, you have to continue to follow the guidelines, but we don't require the rest of it to necessarily be landscaped. We do require 25% live plant cover and then 2 to 3 inches of mulch anywhere else except if it's native plants or pollinator habitat, in which case you can have an exception for those areas. So that was a way we got around people having to have mulch over their entire yard if only 25% of it is plant cover. And mostly these are just a balance between how much we wanted to require of people versus the benefits that we would get from those for the community. So we were trying to weigh those benefits against the kinds of obligations people would have as part of our code.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Just on, we haven't gotten to your plant list. I've never seen your plant list, actually.
Still being developed, right? Yeah.
Okay. There are many drought tolerant plants that are not native to Moab that people ought to be able to consider. I know Cara Doranwood brings in a lot of those and they're wonderful, but they are native to Moab. And number two, one of the big problems I think people have here with propagating even native plants is the weeds. And that is an issue that I think really should be part of this landscape ordinance. There has to be a way to deal with not just the state noxious weeds, but tremendous influxes of weeds such as foxtails and things like that, that destroy everybody's ability to have even a decent landscape of any sort. So that's something you may want to think about with this ordinance.
I'm a former chair of the Grand County Noxious Weed Control Board, and I would just let everybody know that there is a state noxious weed list, but there is also a county noxious weed list. There are all 3 levels of noxious. There's a federal list too, but there is a county noxious weed list. The Grand County Weed Control Board is also they also meet tonight. And they are also they're always looking for new commissioners. And there are a couple species on the Grand County weed list that are supplementary to the state list. Arundo grass, for example, was added in 2019. It is not on the state list, it is on the county list. And when those plants are classified and added, the noxious weed control supervisor, Elizabeth Weimhold, can compel private landowners to get them under control when necessary. So that's part of how the county is empowered. I think that's a great idea. I entirely agree with you. And it's just that that nuance of county government is oftentimes overlooked in favor of the planning commission, the varsity team. We've got we've got the other board and they're desperate for people who are going to go over there and throw some ideas out. So
we do have the requirement in the draft ordinance to maintain your property with no noxious weeds per the state list, but we could add.
I think it's for the county
per
list,
county.
actually.
Okay, we'll make sure that that's in there.
as a general rule, the county list includes the state list plus extra.
Okay, got it. Okay, so yeah, I think that this, these calculations, can be a conversation and we can play around with different scenarios and see what would be realistic in terms of this requirement for living plants coverage and inorganic ground cover versus organic ground cover.
Something that's occurring to me right now that might be a potential solution to this is having different requirement numbers depending on the Albernic region, or even maybe a more specific set of regions. I mean, these requirements, the majority of what we're asking for here currently, the way it's designed is mulch. And I think Dale has brought up a really significant reason why we might want to rethink that in terms of in certain areas, there's too much wind. But as it is, there's not that much plant material that's required. There's not that, it's a very mulch heavy suggestion. Like if somebody's going to go with the easiest version of this set of requirements, they're going to put down a lot of mulch. And so that may need to be tinkered with. And then there's this the requirement is 30% living plant materials. I think Tony brings up a really good point that may not really be applicable or even possible in a lot of places. However, in some places it might be possible and it might be worth encouraging. So maybe that's something that we nuance based on the area.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
On this draft ordinance, I think it's F under 6.4.4 general requirements. It cites the landscape plan, capital L, capital P. What is that?
That's in the submittal requirements, which we didn't include.
That's right, sorry. Yeah, so the landscape plan is like what would be the applicant when they come in and do a subdivision or a site plan for commercial development. The way that we would evaluate these requirements is they would draw that on their landscape plan. So it would be part of the site plan or part of, it would just be supplemental. It's like the outdoor lighting plan for a subdivision.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and we didn't include in the draft that we sent to planning commissioners, we just took out all the submittal stuff because we didn't want to overwhelm, and that's not fully fleshed out yet anyway. So we're kind of still working on, that's a whole nother section of the code that will have to be dealt with, and we can workshop that at a future time. Yeah.
I have a question where we kind of now sort of stand. Let's say I did have 10 acres out in Spanish Valley. I was using whatever kind of water I had and I wasn't doing any development. I wouldn't be affected, right, by these rules because I'd be in some senses grandfathered in. Is that roughly right?
Yeah, this ordinance applies to all new development and any existing development that undergoes an addition of 20% of the lot area of impervious surface. So if you were to take your lot and put a bunch of pavement on it, like put a big parking lot right in the middle, then you would have to.
Then I'd have to.
Yeah.
Or put a new structure on it. That would also count towards impervious.
Yeah.
Well, that would go under the building permit.
A new structure, but it would have to increase, it would have to be 20% of the lot area.
Okay, so are there any more kind of thoughts about this slide before we move on? Okay, go ahead, Jerry.
I just got one kind of a random question, but in the 75% of disturbed ground covered, if we went out in like the boonies in Spanish Valley and we looked at some undisturbed ground, would 75% of that be covered, or would like 50% be covered in sand?
I mean, maybe this is a Tony question again, but from my tour that I did with Dale the other day, I was actually trying to answer that question for myself. And in a lot of cases, so 70% no. In terms of the 50% or I guess 30% now plant cover, definitely yes. In undisturbed areas, there was 30% plant cover. Maybe that's not always true. And I think the idea of going away from that is that we are not dealing with undisturbed soil. The soil is different. It's not held down in the same way. It is necessary to have more ground cover over it in order to mitigate dust.
Jerry, the folks who have those numbers in real life are the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, literally invented the protocol. It's called the Transect Survey. They do stem counts, they count drip zones, they figure it out.
That varies a lot by area too. I mean, we got areas around here that are 100% rock too. So.
I just want to acknowledge the place also of like cryptobiotic soil crust in maintaining like a lot of our soil keeping in place.
Yeah.
you know, those are like, it's its own ecosystem, but you know, like, Katie's saying, like the land that's disturbed, all of like the cryptobiotic soil crust or other organisms that would keep the dirt in place otherwise are no longer present. And so that's why there are exceptions, I'm assuming, right, in these situations.
Yeah, we're not
That's
just
why the
talking
dirt-
about like an area without plants, because it could have cryptobiotic soil,
Right.
and that would be undisturbed.
Yeah, which is
Yeah.
why when you drive, you know, down to San Juan County and you see all these big fields of native plants existing, you don't see huge clouds of dust coming up, but when you're passing all the dryland farming, you often can't see across the road because there's so much dust in the air, so. Right.
Okay, I might just back up and go back to what we were kind of talking about with some of these exemptions. So I think we can keep this conversation alive about the exemptions for larger facilities that are turf intensive. But I guess I want to maybe take your temperature on like maybe a straw poll or something, I don't know, OB, on these two topics, just to get a sense of where we're thinking of going with this ordinance. I don't know. It's an
So
idea.
what
We don't have-
question would you like
Well,
us to straw poll on? And
These two, the existing, so the large facilities such as schools, cemeteries, golf courses, parks, whether or not those would be kind of a blanketed exemption, or if we should look at those in kind of nuanced way.
And
in the
it would
ordinance.
be the same thing, they'd have the exception of if they were developing and putting 20% more.
Even for new, like a new golf course or a new public recreation facility, would we want to apply this ordinance to those new developments too?
You know, Tony,
I would just put it out there that if you're gonna say that. I'm specifically thinking about schools, athletic areas.
Mm-hmm.
The alternative to having sod is having that, the new age, the plastic turf.
That's not
I've
allowed.
played football on it. One, it's horrible, but also, and this is an important point, sod does still provide some habitat value. Burrowing animals, insects, bugs. You rip out the football field, you replace it with that mulch tire and plastic. There is no wildlife there at all. So just think about that.
Yeah.
You know, the grass is still alive. You know?
And just to add to that, a clarification point, currently, artificial turf is not allowed in the ordinance.
Okay.
That's right, yeah.
Not at all.
Because it gets so hot in the summertime.
We don't have to do a straw poll. It was just,
no,
I mean, I was just kind of.
but other thoughts on this issue?
I can add one more thing. Another thing that, way that we could nuance this is, what a lot of the other counties have done is, had a requirement based on use for turf. So turf can only be used in recreational areas. Then you have to define what the recreational area is, explain why it's recreational and how big, why it has to be that size in order to achieve, you know, whatever you're doing with it. We could try to build something like that in, you know, these types of facilities have an exemption if they're doing, you know, recreational activities and they can prove it and they can prove that they need this much space.
Right.
I have a question.
Yes. Can you put your mic? It's okay.
If we're exempting the schools and athletic areas, wouldn't they be already exempted if they were using secondary water sources? And aren't they required to have that in the county right now anyway?
I don't think they're required to use secondary water.
It's an.
Oh, in the county. Yeah, you're
County.
probably right.
Yeah, because all the subdivisions are required to have a secondary water source now, right?
If
If it's within, yeah, I think we put it at 300 feet.
Yeah.
No, that was kind of just something we pulled from a different ordinance, but would you have a recommendation for that distance? Okay,
A lot of that's going to depend on, are they gonna be able to get easement in the county road?
right.
And if they are close.
Yeah,
The
there's a
county
lot of
doesn't
moving
allow that?
parts there. What's that?
The county road department wouldn't let you put that. Oh, I think they want. You have to pay for it.
Yeah.
I totally agree that they should be exempted. I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
I've always thought the area after they're digging up should turn into a golf course. Always been my, and I think they should be exempted.
So I think it would be wise then, I think what I'm hearing you say is like, definitely make sure that these have to be using secondary water no matter what. Yeah. Okay.
And I did kind of like the idea in terms of recreational, you know, then it might make schools be a little more efficient. Some other areas, you know, they don't necessarily need lawn everywhere, but they certainly need it in recreation areas.
Right.
So you might think about working in that area.
A couple weeks ago, I noticed there is some draft legislation this year regarding landscaping ordinance stuff exactly like this at the state level, specifically for state funded institutions like schools and certain public recreation facilities. I would just triple check with legal that that stuff either has or has not been passed,
Okay.
and that this would conform with that.
Right. We don't want it to conflict with that legislation. Okay.
Lisa,
Yes.
as you think about the irrigation requirements as well, look at Camp Lake from a picture. Limited and most of it's owned, so we can't go requiring that everybody connect to it when they can't provide.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's very limited and you're reaching capacity in terms of providing additional secondary taps for irrigation. So that's something that is kind of on the radar for bigger picture water planning and developing, you know, new sources. So definitely part of the bigger conversation. Okay, so that, I think that gives us a really good sense of where we're all thinking on the public facilities or golf courses included in that. And for personal livestock, I think we did get a lot of feedback. We took good notes and we can kind of work on some alternative options for that as well. And come back to you with some more revisions on that. So moving on, pools and hot tubs. We don't have a lot of pools in Moab, but I don't know if this is something we want to be concerned about in regulating or just not even worry about it. I don't see that a lot of properties have pools, so I don't know.
Do we, excuse me for not knowing this, but do we have any rules about commercial pools and how that operates? Like, are they charged when they're putting a pool in? Is there like a fee or anything regarding water use?
I mean, I don't know if it would be GWISA that would have some kind of a extra fee or something. Yeah.
Okay.
It's culinary water.
Yes. So they're paying a lot of money to GWISA for that.
I don't believe evaporation, right? It might be less water, full evaporating than water in the lawn. So.
Yeah, I just hate to see us regulating individual people who have a little pool for their kids when there's every single hotel has a pool that's evaporating.
Right.
And
The
just sitting
commercial
there.
uses could
Yeah.
be something to look at, right?
We raised our rates too, so those people are gonna be paying quite a bit.
Yeah.
You know, if they put in a big.
How much did you raise your rates?
It goes by tier. Ben, can you?
I don't know.
I believe it was 8%. Well, I think it was 8% for the first 3 tiers, and then 25% for the ones after first 3 or 4, and 25% per tier after that, and it escalates or goes up as each tier compounds on each other. They're paying a lot.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tommy. My only thought on the pool thing is a lot like my thought on the pasture thing is that a landscape, I don't know if I would characterize pool as
Right.
landscaping. A pool is some sort of commercial development, or you know, infrastructure,
Mhm.
whereas,
Yeah, kind of.
landscaping exists somewhere between a fountain and a pool. That's where the line is for me, you know?
So with the city of Moab, their ordinance has requirements about shut off valves for fountains, if you're just bringing up fountains. So we've left this out for sake of simplicity, but I wonder if Alexi, if you wanted to chime in on pools and, because you guys have a lot of, I don't know how much more hotel development is gonna actually happen, but you have a lot of existing pools in the city.
Yeah, we have like pool and spa covers recommended, but I think we left them out as required mainly because we can't really regulate that. Like we're gonna evaluate somebody's plan, but we're not gonna go in their backyard every day to see what they're doing with it.
Right.
So it's a recommendation, but not a requirement. We do have the water budget feature that we added to our ordinance for more flexibility for people who had different kinds of landscapes that maybe we weren't thinking of in a prescriptive sense. And in that we do have people include water features, like if they have a little brook that they created in their backyard or some sort of little pond, it's included as a special section of their water budget that is high water.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think we've gotten as far as figuring out if we were gonna use a water budget. I think we left it out so far, right?
I feel like we have been erring towards not using a water budget.
Right.
Mostly because I think our situation in the county is quite different than the city. There's a lot of people with water rights. And the framework of a water budget, even though I do see the advantage in terms of the flexibility, and saying, well, you could follow these very prescriptive rules, or alternatively, if you want to prove that you're not using more than X amount of water, then you can, do whatever you want, within a certain set of framework, to achieve that. That said, I think putting a hard limit on water in the county is going to be tricky. I think it's going to be unpopular with people who have water rights.
Any other thoughts on these items before we move on?
So the consensus on pools is not to address it at this point.
It sounds like it. I think that's. I mean, I like the city's approach of having recommendations for certain things that you can do to mitigate evaporation and,
I think
waste.
the people with a pool that don't have a cover are gonna find out pretty quick that it's over anyway.
Exactly.
I think it's worth noting, I tend to agree that it doesn't really seem related enough to landscaping to really make sense to be in the ordinance. But I think we have learned some interesting things in that pools require culinary water insofar as it's the priority that the county has to reduce the use of culinary water. Maybe in the future, it makes sense to think about pools in another capacity.
Yeah, for sure. Even more of a reason to develop our secondary water sources. Okay, so plumbing requirements. So these are going to be taking the ordinance to kind of another level of regulation. Other areas in southern Utah have implemented these requirements, including Washington County, St. George, and the city of Moab. Correct me if I'm wrong, Alexi, but we're just basing this on our read of your ordinance, but that these requirements include water sense labeled fixtures, including but not limited to faucets, shower heads, toilets, and urinals, and Energy Star qualified appliances. So that's one thing in itself. That's a big step that we would be just considering as part of this ordinance. So I wanted to get all of your ideas on that.
It's a landscaping ordinance.
I know, right?
Second.
I know if we wanted to change the name to water conservation ordinance, we could maybe, but
It would be less to revise.
right.
Yeah, this feels
It
like,
would be like a whole different thing.
this feels outside the purview, and I'm also concerned about affordability for community members that
Right.
maybe can't afford the nicest, fanciest appliances
Water,
and stuff.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think if we go down this path, it should go into building code.
Right, I think it would be appropriate if we wanted to, the county wanted to do something like this, it just would be appropriate in a different place and not here.
But I would raise the issue of the bottom, the very bottom one, this 300 feet thing, and how practical that is and how much it costs, and whether, I guess, WISA could actually do this with
So that's what we just kind of brought this up, and it is problematic in the sense that there's a limited capacity to Ken's Lake, which is the secondary water source. We don't want to necessarily be tapping and developing new wells for that. So I think that really we should probably be considering holding off on this requirement until there's more alternative secondary water sources that are developed or being developed. I guess that's kind of where we're at. Yes, Tony.
Ben, you can hate me for saying this if you want to, it's cool. But is there a way, I mean, 300 feet, whatever that is, I know that WISA is doing an excellent job metering and making sure they know how much is left in Ken's Lake. Is there a way to say that you'll convert to secondary water, connect to secondary water, if you can secure a will serve from WISA? And then, that makes more work for you, which I'm sorry, dude.
Really, that's the way it works right now.
It is, we do.
Okay, so if you get a will serve for secondary water, you have to use it anyway. So I mean, if that's already on the books, then
Yeah. I think
it's cheap.
if it's available, that's the thing. Not everywhere has the ability to connect to it, to that system. So it depends on how far they're willing to go to connect to it, if it's further from their lot or subdivision. So I think that is always an option for developers or people subdividing, is to put that in if it's close and doable. And we encourage that.
Can we put in where practical?
Where practical, and with the will serve approval, of course, that's just granted, but yeah.
Right, it's only practical if they would accept it. So I mean, if that's a condition of getting the subdivision approved.
If this is already
be possible.
If this is already happening, do we need to focus on it?
I don't know if our land use code, I don't think we require the secondary hookup if it's like within a certain.
Sure, and my point being is if people are interested in this and the market is driving itself.
Yeah.
Is this a moot point and we're over engineering this ordinance?
Possibly.
That's kind of where my head's been at for the last 45 minutes.
A couple little points. One, and Dale, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember this from our tour, you're saying toward the end, and I was bringing up a concern that Aaron brought up about it can be very expensive to connect to secondary water. And is this necessarily something that we want to require people to do if it's very expensive? And Dale, your point was that in the development phase, when you are developing something new, it actually is, it's still maybe somewhat pricey, but it's a lot less pricey than it would be later on. And I think this and the requirement below about gray water are both attempting to avoid the situation where you get development that just doesn't even think about this, and then it becomes impossible later on because it's so expensive. And regardless of the market changing, if you have a development that was built without access to this and it becomes much more difficult, that's a very different proposition. Then because it's much more expensive, it's a different market. So
yeah, I think we could reword this, and I think the 300-foot distance is definitely something to just keep with a grain of salt, but we'll have to think about it in terms of sort of encouraging, or do we want to actually have some more requirement language? I think that's something to ponder for sure.
I'll just throw out that the cost of building in Moab already is so insanely high. Right. And so all we're doing with these requirements is we're going to increase the cost to the end user. So just throwing a plug in that.
If it's beneficial to the end user that they actually save themselves money from being able to have a secondary water source for irrigation instead of using their culinary, maybe there's some kind of a balance where it's worth, where it pencils or something, or it might kind of makes the development work better, even just voluntarily.
My thought on it is gonna be, you know, the higher sticker price where we're already looking at, you know, for folks trying to buy a home, just the cost of down payment. I mean, that's where that is gonna be impacted, you know, it's just gonna increase that. And I mean, I just was in a meeting where the superintendent of the National Park Service cannot afford, you know, the average house there. I mean,
It's real for sure.
So, yeah.
Now, we don't want to be increasing building costs. That's definitely true.
Oh, you guys see this? You know.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put this onto the record just so I can throw shade at my friends over in Washington County because I work with them a good bit. Washington County consumes more water per capita than any other county in the country.
Yeah, it's insane.
And
Like that, friends.
yeah, they do. And they are making great strides in conserving water, but the lack of preemptive water conservation has created a condition where they will run out of water in 10 years. That's a statistical fact.
Right.
So I don't put Washington County as a city on the hill in terms of water conservation planning.
And one thing that Dale has pointed out to us is they have some of the cheapest, if not the cheapest water in the state. Is that correct? I can't remember that part, but.
The state of Utah has some of the cheapest excess water rates of anywhere in the entire country, according to this article, which I can send to all of you. Yeah, it was on KSL.
Yeah, I've heard that before as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Corey had his hand up. I'm going to let you speak, Corey.
Sure. Just regarding the WaterSense and Energy Star fixtures, minor component of that might help some of this discussion is maybe meeting in the middle is that this was a relatively late addition to the landscaping ordinance that we had, but was identified within a couple options. So we ended up opting into all new development or overnight accommodations that are newly developed or being remodeled, refreshed, those types of elements. So that is to say, if your commission's interested, you don't have to bundle all types of developments. You could focus on commercial or particular types of uses opting into this if there are concerns about their water usage, but also their ability to incorporate these costs versus maybe, like you say, you're developing or redeveloping residential uses. So that's just a distinction that you might be able to use as an additional tool.
Thank you. Yeah, that does make sense. The nuance there is good. Any other thoughts on the plumbing requirements?
I had one more thought on the 300-foot in the secondary, and that is kind of to your point, Steve, if the intent of this is to reduce water usage, do we at some point get to the point where it's not even worth running secondary water because we're using so little outside? Well, maybe. And so maybe it's better, kind of to your point, Tony, to focus on reduction in water and less on making it easy to use.
Right. Yeah, there's a balance there for sure. The last point on this slide, and it's kind of related to what we've been talking about in general, but in terms of requiring new development to install plumbing that's compatible with gray water recycling. This is cheaper to do in the front end of development and construction process instead of retrofitting on the back end. So this is an alternative to, having to connect to secondary systems that could be more expensive or even not even possible. So I guess we could maybe bring Aaron in on this. Do you have some thoughts?
I was,
Justin.
yeah, I've been listening to the meeting on Zoom. So, yeah, I just did a workshop over at Arroyo Crossing. Now, each one of those places has a secondary water in there. And as to the cost, it almost saves them $800 per unit by using secondary water because they don't need backflow preventers. They don't need expensive stop and waste. It was like, I was like, right there, their irrigation's cheaper. So if you want a counter argument to like, it adds more cost, there's that. Now, as for the development, how much they brought that water in there, how much did it add? Probably added something to it. But I mean, I think the point is we're trying to protect the Glen Canyon aquifer, right? That's our drinking water. If we run out of Ken's Lake water and you can't landscape, sorry, but we still have water to drink. So I think there is a strong argument for putting in secondary water because, you know, it is something that, okay, yeah, it ran out. Like there's consequences, but it's not as big consequences as like, well, are you washing your car with water we can like flush a toilet with? That kind of thing.
Right.
As for the putting in gray water, right now, I tell people that want to do the gray water system, it's, you know, if you like to garden and you're like putzing around in your yard, awesome. It's going to save you 50 cents a month. You know, like you can run 6 fruit trees off of it, which, you know, what's that? 1,000 gallons, which is 50 cents. 1,000 gallons if you have secondary water in Arroyo Crossing, but it's cool. But if that price of the water starts going up, then that's something good. And like, if you want me to retrofit like a house on a slab, $20,000.
Right.
If you want me to build it now, $600. We roll that into your mortgage. But it's pennies a month for doing that. I just don't think it adds that much cost. You know, I also talked to Katie about, you know, we have a couple experimental things here in the city where there's a guy that's never flushed a toilet or done laundry, all with rainwater. And he's like, hey, it only cost a few $1,000s and it's rolled in my mortgage. You know, like, yeah, it's more money, but when you put in a 30-year loan, it's like, how much it was it? Right. So those are things I would point out.
No, that's great.
And then Tony put a note, should landscaping code apply to appliances? I tell you what, our water is hard here. And when a shower head fills up with calcium, I take that flow restrictor right out. It's just kind of like,
yeah,
that's what people do. I think it's like, yeah, okay. Like, is the building inspector gonna check you removed your flow inspector, annual flow inspector in your shower thing. It's like pennies to dollars in terms of like what our landscaping stuff is.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay, that's good to know too.
Yeah, sorry. I was listening on that. I was like, oh, I'm missing the best part.
Hey guys, Aaron's here.
Okay, that's all really good feedback, you guys. Thank you so much. I'm gonna move on to the next slide. It's almost 7 o'clock, so I kind of want to wrap this up. As far as turf limitations, we have here in the ordinance, turf grass shall not be used in more than 10% of the total lot area, 200 square feet or 200 square feet of turf, whichever is smaller. And no turf shall be used. Is this straight from the state requirements?
Although I believe it may have changed the state requirements because that's no longer on their website. It used to be, and it's in all the other ordinances in the state. So I'm not sure.
What do you guys have in the city for turf limitations? I can't remember.
Yeah, this is what we have in here. It's 10% or 200 feet. And then we have the water budget option, which I understand that might not be something that you're interested in doing. And it's helped us with people who are coming in who want to put like a roof over their porch and they need a building permit and now they need to change their landscaping. So this is where it stands for us.
Okay.
Just to clarify, there is one small difference between this and what the city has, which is that you guys have whichever is greater and we have whichever is smaller. In point A.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
That is really tiny.
Less than one.
Yeah, that is really small.
So which of those two matches the state requirement?
The state requirement is much higher.
What is the state requirement for turf?
Alexi, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's 50%.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
correct. Theirs is 50. But like you said, I'm gonna see if I can find the original letter we received because it was more than 10, but I thought it was originally less than 50. However, how it is written now on the website is 50.
Okay. Yeah, so in this current version, we've taken it down quite a bit, but that's all up for conversation, you know? I mean, is it realistic to expect that people would have that small of an amount of turf in the county? We have larger lots. There's gonna be areas that don't have as, you know, hopefully we can get some zoning that allows for smaller lots as well in the county, coming up with the future land use plan, so maybe we need to adjust for lot size. Maybe if you have a larger lot, you have a lot more land to work with. You should be allowed to do something different. I don't know how that would work.
I think worst case, we never would want to go over with the state.
Oh, for sure, because then we wouldn't be eligible for the turf buyback program. So we'd have to max out at 50%.
It just
It's also-
confirmed, sorry, that was what they sent in the original letter, the 50%.
50%, and then they have a square footage alternative or no?
That it doesn't apply to lots that are less than 250 square feet. So
Oh, right.
if you're small enough, then you don't have to follow it because it's impossible for you to have a lot of grass.
Yeah.
250 square foot.
Must be.
That's a parking.
I think one point that it's worth remembering in terms of feasibility of this is that this is mostly applying to new construction. So this is people putting in a lawn that wasn't there before. In the case of coming into compliance, again, it would be about adding a significant amount of additional impermeable cover, which, you know, would happen in some circumstances, but mostly this is about new construction.
And
So-
can I chime in?
Oh, we have another member of the public. Yes.
Gary Wilson. Two concerns really quickly. I know it's getting late. The one thing about the animals that aren't for eating or whatever that was. I don't know that you're considering that there's a fairly large contingent of people in the valley that have horses for recreation, and they do eat grass, and it's a big issue. In fact, to me, it's the way I make a living. And also, it's been mentioned several times about the grass, again, the native grasses in pastures. You're wasting money watering native grasses for animals to eat. It's non-efficient. You need the grasses that are designed for forage, that you can water, you can produce a bunch of feed for the animals, and you're not wasting any water that way. You're gaining a lot more forage for the animals. Be careful, don't in this ordinance, get rid of the agriculture in the valley, and I see some of that where you're going. So I'm just saying, please be careful with that. And horses are a big contingent. We've got people that do animals for fiber. You don't eat those. You're taking the fiber off of them for the sheep. There's goats. There's that kind of stuff. So I appreciate giving me a time to speak. Thanks.
Just a quick clarification, Gary. I think we talked about this before you came on, but commercial applications, commercial agricultural and livestock applications are exempted from the ordinance.
Yeah, and
I understand, but the bottom line is not everybody's commercial that's got a horse in the backyard and a half an acre.
yeah, and I totally hear you, Gary. I apologize for my silly statement. I don't know where my mind was going, but no, you're right. We have a lot of horse properties in the county, and that's a huge contingent of our population, or not a huge, but a significant amount. So yeah, that's definitely not in contradiction to this ordinance. And we did kind of have the conversation with the planning commissioners around this topic. People were leaning towards having some kind of exemption for personal livestock, for sure. So and having more of a recommendation style of, you know, educating on drought resistant grasses or feed that could be cultivated as an alternative to something that's more water intensive. So I appreciate your comments for sure.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we've pretty much covered everything here. The only last slide here is just to talk about, we did put a little section in the ordinance that would help to address drainage on properties. We've had this discussion with the county engineer and others in our staff discussions on how difficult it is, and also I should say with the building department, how difficult it is to have any kind of say on drainage on individual lots. So we have this system right now where we can address that during the subdivision phase, but when it comes to building permits, there's nothing to be done really. So this would be a way to kind of help people understand what their drainage is on their property, and then and have them actually respect the natural drainage and help to infiltrate water back into the ground. So.
I could be wrong. It sounds like Jeff Adams. But I like those requirements actually. Yeah. Again, on something that's newly built, it makes sense.
If anybody's ever done detention study work on commercial properties, it's a horrid exercise to go through. I think you've done a really nice job.
I'm again just going to advise caution, dissent respectfully here. Much of the natural landscape of Grant County consists of highly impermeable sediments like clays, expansive clays, which sheet up quickly and rapidly transport surface water away from this place where the water lands. Permaculture does not inherently work in every landscape. Minimizing the consumption of water means keeping the water transportation and the mobility of water through the landscape as undisturbed as possible. A thought exercise here that we see in wildlife and landscape restoration at the state level is that you want to install a beaver dam analog, a pile of sticks in a creek to help slow down the water and stem the tide of stream bank erosion. The Division of Water Rights will make you get a water right to install your beaver dam analog because you are reducing the amount of mobile water on landscape. So these are things to think about. You could absolutely affect the natural flow, transportation, and delivery of water if you implement this kind of work in every single spot. It is parallel to the greening of the West philosophies that proper water conservation should be trying to get away from. Expansive clays do not have an organic layer. There is no O layer in the soil horizon. I strongly encourage people to read the Almernic ecoregions and those geographic descriptions. It is the gold standard of geographic description of landscapes across the country. It is what the EPA uses. So check it out. And I'm just gonna speak my piece there. There's things a landscape should be, and there's things a landscape shouldn't be. And it's incredibly nuanced.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question?
Yeah.
So this is currently only required in disturbed areas. Have we not gone far enough there? And would it maybe be useful to nuance this further by applying this only to specific ecoregions, or is this really like a get rid of it?
No, I don't think it's a get rid of it. There's parts of this that I like. I think I might have, like the second bullet about capturing water, leaving roofs is great because roofs increase the velocity of water as it impacts the ground and accelerate erosion. We don't want to accelerate erosion either, but when I hear pre-existing natural drainages, I'm immediately thinking like, why don't we just not disturb this?
Well, a lot of them are already disturbed in some of these cases where there's been lots that have been historically, worked over.
So maybe I just needed that little bit of specificity there. Maybe it just wasn't captured in the bullet.
Yeah.
But this is, and Jeff is my friend, I respect his work very much, but this is Terra Sophia's playbook. And
Yeah.
that's just not necessarily correct.
Well, so in
Every single spot.
our land use code already, under drainages and I can't remember what other section it's called, stormwater management, I think. We do have a strict rule that you are not to disturb the natural drainage when you go in and subdivide or do commercial development. You're supposed to, you're required to respect the natural drainage. And that gets inspected by Bill or the engineer usually. But we're more and more, we're paying attention to that, right? Ever since August 2022. So it goes back to that. Like we're trying to pay attention more to smaller situations on smaller lots that may have been disturbed already, that have gone away from their natural drainage, and we can't necessarily do something about that until they pull a building permit.
No, I understand the reason for it, and I let stemming the tide of negative impacts is a good thing.
Yeah.
But with this, maybe just a fourth bullet that's like, have you done your detention basin study on your lot beforehand? This is the big thing. I think when we spoke, a big thing I think people developing lots should need to capture is an understanding of the ecosystem functions of a landscape as they exist before before additional human intervention.
Right.
I just want to quickly add, I love these discussions. You learn a lot.
Right? Yeah, I love this. And I think this is a very complex issue, as I think I was trying to introduce at the beginning, and I think it's important to nuance with these different perspectives. I really respect this opinion, Tony, and I've been trying to work backwards from it actually in this ordinance a lot. And I have the same concerns that you do. I think I wanted to add one clarifying thing about, submittal requirements. So we didn't include those here, but just a brief overview of what we're thinking is we will be requesting drainage plans in the submittal requirements. A very simple one in sort of like the general level that doesn't require any type of calculation, is more just draw your land on, a very simple plan, show us where the water is moving, show us different elevations, and these are the lines of where water is moving. This is where you plan to retain it. This sort of second level is going to require, that is, more commercial developments would require more serious calculations. But we are asking everybody to do a little bit of research into how water moves on their landscape.
I'm happy for that. Thank you.
So Tony, going back to what your thought was about the pre-existing natural drainages, and then Katie, your talk about, or maybe Lisa mentioned that we shouldn't be changing them, which I agree, that's what you should do when you set up your development, is not change the natural drainage. Maybe starting with something like don't change the natural drainage, and then putting if they are disturbed, put that further down. Changing the order might at least help that somewhat.
Yeah, it's very likely a function of the way that I process written text inside my brain.
Yeah, no worries. We've rephrased this a few times, and when you have the context as we do with the land use code overall, and we're kind of like assuming that those things are already there, and then but I think it's good to, in each section, to kind of reiterate for people, because not everybody's looking at all the sections for their particular project. They're just narrowing down on what they need to be looking at. So to
to clarify
Sorry,
Yeah.
go ahead.
just to clarify a little bit about how this is structured in terms of who this would apply to. Currently, we just have this disturbed versus undisturbed area, and this is falling within the general disturbed area, which again is based on past land use. It may not have actually influenced the natural drainage, so maybe it would be necessary to create a separate qualification for whether the drainage is disturbed or not.
I just had one more question. I know we're running late, but
Yeah.
that is regarding compliance with landscaping requirements before CO. Have you put any thought into that? Because I know a lot of people like CO done, get moved in and then finish the landscape.
Yeah, that's a whole kind of can of worms that we would be dealing with when we address that supplemental section on submittal requirements and review and kind of how we finally approve what's going in. I don't think we've really crossed that bridge yet, have we? No, yeah.
What I was telling Katie is I see so much improper against code landscaping here.
Right.
And it's because you build your house, who knows where the water line is? It's magic finding it. And then you dig it up and then it's just like, oh yeah, just attached to that hose. Like it's done. I've always felt that the CO should at least be to your backflow preventer because that's a public safety thing. And it's not like that's a low risk, but I've always felt like, why isn't that basic part done? Until, like that should be a part of the plumbing because the janky crap I see around like this county,
Yeah.
I'm like, this is like, it causes a lot of damage to people's houses.
Sure, yeah.
So,
Can I ask Alexi or Corey to chime in on how you guys dealt with, like, did you tie the requirements or verifying that the landscape plan was implemented to like a C of O, or how did you guys do that in the end?
I certainly have a comment on this, but Lexi, why don't you go first? I mean, I think both Lexi and I work closely with Barry Ellison, our building official, on that point. But Lexi, if you wanted to touch on it first.
Well, a lot of where I'm involved is in the plan review. And we have a few months in now, we have developed calculators and tables and things to try to make it easier. So a lot of what we do is on that front end of trying to get the plans in order. And then I'll let Corey talk more about working with Barry.
Sure, and I'll try to keep this quick, but essentially what this ordinance is doing is making landscaping a regulatory element, not that much different from what a development standard would be, elements of the structure, so to speak. So in our approval sets, they're required to be installed in a similar way, or what would be really similar to like a master plan development or something that a landscaping element was very particularly approved by the land use authority. That's not typical about kind of smaller residential development, but that's what this has become. So to getting to your point is if they have an approved building permit plan that illustrates they comply with the landscaping provisions within that specific plan, it would have to be installed by the C of O. The option that we have is obviously C of Os are going to come in November, December, January, February, where installation of grasses, trees, other types of vegetation isn't going to make any sense for the longevity of those plants. Is moving into what is a heavy tool for this type of element. So we're working on trying to simplify it, but it's basically a bonding mechanism. Because if we were to we don't offer temporary C of Os, meaning the plans are in near compliance, but you don't have elements, but we're going to give you the C of O anyway, and people will begin occupying that property without it coming into full compliance with the plans. So that's not necessarily a legal element we're secure with. So this bonding mechanism, even as simple as it might be just for a little bit of landscaping, gives them the freedom that they can install, have that inspected and approved at whatever rate they need, because the city is holding that security that if at whatever turning point that property is moving out of the construction phase, it's selling, whatever it might be, if the installation isn't done by the applicant, the city has the capacity to fix that or bring it up into the compliance. So I hope that answers the question, but basically it's security bond, depending on the scale of that.
Okay, that definitely answers that. Thank you. Okay, so like I said, we have a lot of great feedback that we got from everybody tonight. I really appreciate you coming, members of the public and Ben. So we'll go back and rework some of these main sticking points and kind of probably come back with a more final draft that we can share. And then also the submittal requirements will be discussed as well. So I think that's it for our workshop, unless anybody has any last minute things.
I guess we're done then.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks Katie for all your work.
Thanks everyone for your input. It's been incredibly helpful. I have like 5 pages of notes.
And thank you so much, Alexi and Corey, for sticking through with us all the way till the end. That was awesome. Okay, have